Britain in the 1930s was not always a happy place to be. The country faced economic hardship. Many battled with unprecedented levels of poverty, and the policymakers of the day were preoccupied with one central and crucial question: should Britain rearm her once mighty military ahead of what many believed would be a second Great War with Germany? Yet, despite this ongoing sense of foreboding, the months of 1936 were dominated by a question that seemed almost trivial. The newly installed king, Edward VIII, had fallen in love with the soon-to-be twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson, and he was determined to become husband number 3. In this debut season of our brand new podcast, we explore the abdication crisis, attempting to reconstruct events from available source material and solve the many mysteries that surround Britain's most recent royal revolution. Hello, Royal History Geeks, and welcome back to Royal Revolutions. This is Season 1, Episode 2, and the second part of our series on the abdication crisis of 1936. My name is Gareth Streeter, creator of Royal History Geeks, and I am joined by my erstwhile friend and collaborator, James Taylor. James, how are you?
Right, thanks, Gareth. How are you?
I am not too bad, thank you. Just so everybody knows, we're recording this very early in the mornings to squeeze this into our otherwise busy schedule. So if we both look a bit, that's probably why. But we do it for you, and we do it for the love of royal history. Thank you to all those who listened to the first episode last week, where we charted the early lives and early love affair of Wallace and Edward, or Wallace and David, as he was known by his friends and loved ones. This week, we're starting to look more into how things start to become more heated and serious in the public eye in 1936. But before we dive in, James, did you have, since we last recorded, do you have any other reflections on what we spoke about last week? Anything else you wanted to say about the early lives and meetings of Edward and Wallace?
Not really, but I would say that, as we said, you seem to have more sympathy for her than you do him on the way that they seem to present themselves, I would say.
Yes, I certainly think that's true. That's been my experience throughout the whole research of the podcast. One extra note I would talk, because we were talking about last week how Wallace was not necessarily the kind of coquettish female fatale that had the king in her sights from early days, wanted the top job and was going to stop at nothing to get it kind of figure. She wasn't an Anne Boleyn, or at least that particular trope or interpretation of Anne Boleyn in the way that I perhaps rather lazily had always thought she was.
Or rather, as a lot of Anne Boleyn supporters would say, Jane Seymour.
That's true. Yes, that's certainly true. But interestingly, I was going through my notes again while I was editing the episode, and I'd forgotten to mention a letter that Wallace wrote to her aunt Bessie, who, as you rightly said in the last episode, is probably who Wallace was named after, because Wallace's first name was actually Bessie. And it's clear her and her aunt are incredibly close, and will be incredibly close throughout this period. But she writes to her aunt, I met the Prince, after her first meeting with Edward, so I met the Prince of Wales last night, which was absolutely been my plan. You know, this is something that I wanted to happen. And again, I don't think you can in any way infer from that that's Wallace saying, I want to be Queen of the United Kingdom. But I think it's just further evidence that she sees herself mixing in the higher circles. That she is probably a little bit grasping, a little bit money grabbing and socially ambitious, but there's certainly no evidence of any long-term game plan for the throne.
No, because there's a big difference between the two, isn't there? You know, you can want to be meeting, and also one has to question whether it was just the Prince of Wales she wanted to meet. I mean, obviously he was a young, seems an exciting figure, went about a lot in society. Whereas, you know, his younger brother, the Duke of York, was married, had children, was less publicly visible at in society events. But at the same time, one would question whether she would have wanted to meet other darlings of the day, or whether it was only the Prince of Wales that she was after. And I would, my own take on it is that it was meeting people who were socially advantageous rather than just looking for the Prince of Wales. And also, even if it were in the Prince of Wales, there's a big difference between saying you want to meet him to get connections in society to be able to go to certain events, than there is wanting to marry him and be queen. I mean, I think that's taking the extrapolation too far.
No, I completely agree. So last week we paused with the death of George V. We didn't go into any great detail about it, and indeed I don't think we should. The death of George V is reasonably controversial, but this is not a George V podcast, and I think we can save that for another time and another show. But let's talk for a minute about the new king, Edward VIII's reaction to his death, because there are accounts, and it's difficult to know how trustworthy or even how eyewitness these accounts were, but he was quite overcome with emotion at the death of his father, clung to his mother quite inappropriately, arguably, by the standards of what his mother would have expected, and was quite overwhelmed by her sort of quickly dropping into a curtsy and kissing his hand as the new king, which reads completely in our sort of 21st century mindset, that reads completely like a coping mechanism of I won't manage my grief in this very second by focusing on the practical next step of the future and paying homage to my son. But I thought that was interesting in that there's a lot of psychoanalysis. I don't know how comfortable I am with any of this psychoanalysis of Edward in his sexuality and sexual relationships, seeking out a mother figure. And again, I think there's possibly a note in these accounts of his own ascension where he was seeking out for a bit of maternal support in the way that a child might, and finds himself quite coldly rejected. Is that something you've come across in your own studies particularly?
It is, but the thing I would say about Queen Mary and her reaction is that it's entirely in character. Because if you remember when later, when George VI died, and the new Queen Elizabeth II came to London because she was in Kenya when she acceded, and Queen Mary came to Clarence House because she said that her old granny and subject must be the first to kiss her hand, and again, she, even though she was well in her 80s then and quite infirm, was the first to curtsy to her. So it is very much in tune with what we know of Queen Mary. Again, I think that with this, though, I'm not so sure about. I mean, I can imagine that him being distraught because being king is going to be a huge change for him and a huge responsibility to suddenly take on. Even if you have been. We know that he was at times chomping at the bit because he and his father were not necessarily very close. They were not in tune politically, so he was not necessarily getting the grounding for his accession that he would have liked. But at the same time, we have to remember that looking at this in hindsight, there's also that trope of him being incapable, which is based on the fact that he did abdicate within the year. And so that's why I'm not certain that we can accept all of those accounts. And also, there were only very few people in the room.
Yes,
there was Queen Mary, the Duke of York, the Duchess of York was ill. She had flu, so she wasn't there. The Duke of Gloucester, the Duke and Duchess of Kent, and the Princess Royal, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. So I'm not really sure that we can accept so many.
Something else, though, that perhaps does show, or perhaps doesn't, I don't know, that shows either a modernising gesture or a lapse of judgment is pretty much the first thing in Edward's reign that happens, which is the Proclamation. And I think we're very privileged because if we were making, or anyone was making this podcast from 2.5 years ago, we would never have seen a Proclamation unless someone was, quite a bit more seasoned than us in observing royal history and indeed life. You and I have both seen a proclamation ceremony.
Yeah.
We watched. I watched on TV at St James's. Were you there? Or
I was outside.
You were outside.
So I saw the public part of the proclamation, but of course, what we all saw for the very first time, because it had never been shown before, was the first part of the ceremony, which is attended by the new monarch.
The Accession Council.
The Accession Council. Yeah. So that
Penny
was
Morden,
the first.
Brilliant Penny Morden.
But that was the first time that anyone outside of that room, outside the membership of the Accession Council, will have seen that. But of course, the second part of the ceremony was widely known because that was broadcast previously, even as far back as the proclamation of Edward VII. But of course, that's where the monarch traditionally is not in attendance. And at the current King's proclamation, we saw the Duke of Kent and the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester in Friary Court at St James's, watching the proclamation being made from the balcony there. As of course their parents would have been at the proclamation of Edward VIII. Yes. But of course, they were meant to be there. Yes. But of course there was someone that wasn't meant to be there that seems to have been. Well, two people that weren't meant to be there, really. Yes. Because Wallace was very prominent at a window inside St James's Palace. And then, of course, he went to join her, and they were both seen together. And that was widely noted in the newspapers at the time. Not a lot about their relationship, but certainly the fact that she was there did attract attention. We should probably worth saying. I must confess, I don't particularly know the reason why, but there is a long-standing tradition that a monarch is not in any way visible at his or her own proclamation. So even to sort of see Edward looking out a window was not what was expected, and somehow seems undignified, I think, and I think that's the issue. I think it is. I think it is due to the mourning for the previous monarch, because it's not seemly to be seen to be enjoying your own proclamation at the time that you are in the depths of grief for the person who has just died, who has held that office before you. Obviously, in his case, it's his father, but whether it was your grandparent or your uncle, whoever it would be, it's not seen as being seemly and dignified. However, you could view it in two different ways, couldn't you? You can view it as not being seemly, not being dignified, not being the right thing, breaking with tradition, terrible. Or you could see it as a modernising and a more human face of the monarchy, depending on your persuasion. So, but again, it does seem perfectly in character for somebody who was seen as being a moderniser, didn't want to be trapped by the whole traditions of monarchy. It's something that I'm not surprised that he would have done. It's kind of sticking two fingers up, isn't it, to the establishment straight away, which is going to be a theme of his reign, which of course some people would say, what a moderniser, other people would say, well, what a prick, because it's kind of, is this really, well, you can, but is this really the statement you're wanting to dine out on straight away? So, I mean, and I think he's saying two things in that, and I've read his own account of it, which makes it all look casual and spontaneous, which is difficult to logistically think actually how it could have been. Well, yes, because he had to travel from Sandringham, and he also had to arrange for Wallace to be there. So, quite. And because you wouldn't have known, and also, even though, yes, we know that the death of George V was hastened, so it could be published in the morning newspapers rather than the less reputable evening ones. Also, but George V was in extremis before then. He was in a state of health where he was already dying, and so he wouldn't have known the timing of that, those arrangements would have had to have been made very quickly in order to make sure that not only could he be there, but that she would be there to join him. So I think that it's spontaneous in the fact that it happened quickly, but I think it did require a certain degree of planning on his part.
I think that's absolutely right. And as I said, I think he's saying two things. I think one is he's saying, I'm not going to play by your rules to the establishment, and we'll talk in a minute a bit more about why he was, Wallace aside, why Edward VIII's reign was a worrying figure for members of the government and the royal establishment. And he's also saying, Wallace is going to be part of this in some way. I think that's a subtle sign, because of course most of the country still wouldn't have known who Wallis Simpson was, but people in society did, and they did know about the link. And I'm not saying people have read that as him saying, I'm about to marry her. She is, of course, still married, but I think he is saying she's going to be a part of things in whatever that looks like. How did the press at the time cover? Because I must confess, I've not read the coverage. How did they cover Wallace's presence? Was it very much the king with friend Mrs. Ernest Simpson looks out? Yes, it was.
The emphasis was far more on the king being there because that was a break with tradition. But there was no attempt to disguise the fact that she was there with him. But as you say, it was more couched in the fact that Mrs. Ernest Simpson is accompanying the king. She is, a member of the king's set, if you like, who is a regular at Fort Belvedere. There was no real suggestion that there was any type of relationship. It's certainly in the British press, no indication that there was any kind of extramarital relationship happening there. Just that she was a close friend and a confidant, I suppose you might say.
Yes.
But no, not really any suggestion that there was any more than that. And also, I think it's fair to say that even people that were in the know about their relationship, that again, with hindsight, it's easy for us to say, oh, well, it's obviously a precursor to their marriage. Well, as you've just pointed out, in January 1936, she was still married. So she wasn't available. She wasn't on the marriage market. So that at that point, even if you were in the know, I think it would have been a step too far for you to think that, oh, this is necessarily going to happen. She's going to get divorced. He's going to marry her, or he's going to want to marry her. It's never going to happen. I think all of those things are too much for us to be able to read into at this point. And that's where I think that by us looking at the events of 1936 in detail, you're able to try and look at, is this the point where it could have ended? Is this the point where it could have happened? It could have all gone away. And I think that this, we're certainly well in that point now where it is seen as being quite shocking, but I don't think it's so much shocking that she's there. It's more that he's there himself.
Yeah.
He's with you.
I agree. And I think in terms of the problems that the government, the establishment, and others were going to have with Edward VIII, I think it's very important with this podcast, and something that you and I, James, talked about a great deal, is we are royal historians, if that's a thing. And understandably, we therefore, in all of our analysis, look at members of the royal family. And I think it's very important to remember. Now, there are people that say the abdication crisis had nothing to do whatsoever with Wallis Simpson. People wanted the king out for political reasons, and this was all just a very convenient cover. Wallace was a blessing. Now, I don't think that is true. I think part of that attitude comes from our inability to get into the heads of a 1930s person and realise how shocking divorce still was, because it isn't shocking to us today. So I don't agree with that analysis. However, I do think it is fair to say that there was an awful lot of politics going on in the background that made the situation a much more politically charged one than it otherwise would have been, and shows that this story is more than a story about two forbidden lovers who were denied each other and put everything else aside to be together. But I think it's worth just us talking a little bit about why ministers And we must remember, it's always say, oh, well, Edward stuck two fingers up to the establishment, almost what a hero. But actually, of course, when he's falling out with the democratically elected government, and Britain at this point is a full-blown universal suffrage, equal voting rights for men and women democracy.
Yes.
And when he is being very hard to work with from their perspective, that is a problem in a constitutional monarchy, it's a problem in a liberal democracy. And I think it's worth noting, and I hadn't been aware of the extent of this before beginning the research for this project, his ministers and officials were really struggling to work with Edward. He was seen as very leaky, as in he might well give confidential information to an ambassador of a foreign nation. He would leave very sensitive documents lying around the place so that anyone, in the palace could find them, pick them up. He'd take them to places. He'd take documents to places where they weren't meant to be. He wouldn't read things he was meant to read. He would delay government business by not sort of engaging in the way that he was meant to. And this was a huge worry.
And that state papers were returned with wine glass stains on them,
yes.
And all of that sort of like louche behaviour around it. Again, I think it's difficult to judge whether some of that is an exaggeration because of his relationship with those ministers. But yeah, certainly he wasn't seen as being conscientious at the time.
They might well be exaggerated, and they're certainly highly biased, partial sources. But what I would say is they are contemporary to the events.
Yes.
They're not written in hindsight of the abdication crisis.
No.
These are documented struggles and fears people had about him beforehand, including a Foreign Office official saying, I think the King's sanity is in question. We need a Regency Act so that we can relieve him if necessary. Now, that might be, frankly, that's not the business of the Foreign Office, to be frank. So I don't know why Whitman was writing about that. And he had agendas. He was trying to, he was sort of, to an extent, supporting rivals of the then Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, which he had no business in doing. So again, very, very partial source, but it tells us that across the political spectrum there were concerns.
And of course, very telling that the following year, after his brother had acceded, that's when the Regency Act was indeed passed.
Right,
the Regency Act of 1937. But also, just to say as well, that there was, at George V's funeral, the procession, there was something which was seen as a bad omen for the new reign, which was picked up by the contemporary newspapers at the time, when one of the Maltese crosses came loose from the imperial state crown that was being conveyed on the coffin. And it was the new king that stepped forward to pick it up and put it in his pocket, and that was seen as being a bad omen, and that was reported at the time. And so I think that all of those suggestions about his ability to reign, I think that ties into this narrative that was already out there, that this was somehow cursed.
I think that's right, and I think that it's very difficult to understand why any of these things mattered so much without understanding the political context of the 1930s. I am aware that neither James nor I are experts on the 1930s politics. James is sort of a semi-expert on just about everything because his ability to absorb knowledge is so vast. But we are not. That's not our ball game particularly. And so what we've decided to do, because we think it is so important that we're all on the same page with understanding why these things mattered as much as they did, we are now going to zoom in to an interview that we have recorded with Adrien Phillips, who has published books about the abdication crisis, who is an expert on the politics of the 1930s. And if we all listen to that, I think we will all learn vital information that we need to explore the issues we're talking about for the rest of this podcast. You're about to listen to the interview now. You don't need to go anywhere. It's going to appear here. But I just wanted to be honest about something, which is the way we're sort of fitting in all the recordings of this podcast. Although you will seamlessly go into the interview, it will be me chatting to Adrian for about 10 minutes, and then you'll come back and it'll be me and James again. We have not actually recorded the interview with Adrian yet. So there is a chance that in the rest of the episode, we may say something that contradicts what Adrian says or doesn't feel like it flows. And that's because we don't know what he's going to say yet. Or we've got some idea because we've read his stuff, etc., etc. So I just wanted to be frank about that in case there does appear to be any continuity errors. But because of the joys of time travel, we can now beam to the future and visit our interview with Adrian.
Hello, everybody. We are joined by Adrien Phillips, an expert in the 1930s and the abdication crisis, and the author of The King Who Had to Go, The First Royal Media War, and Winston's Bandits, all of which you should add to your reading list if you haven't digested them already. Adrien, thank you for joining us. We had some questions about the politics of the 1930s we were hoping you could help us with. But we are at the point in our podcast that we're making. Edward VIII has just come to the throne in January 1936. Can you tell us a bit more about the political context he was walking into as he ascended?
The internal politics of Britain in the 1930s had reached a good level of stability. You had what was notionally a national coalition government. In practice, it was a conservative government under Stanley Baldwin, with the rump of the Labour Party helping him, some liberals as well. But in practice, it was a solid, secure government under a single individual who counted. Domestically, there was very little difficulty. The economic crisis had been overcome. The India crisis had been overcome, which I think we will come to. It was internationally that there was a problem. We were starting to see the confrontation between Britain and the fascist states, which had begun at the back end of 1935 with fascist Italy under Mussolini shaping up to take over Abyssinia, Ethiopia today. And we had the German reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936. Europe had not been particularly stable, but now it was looking outright dangerous. And I think everybody recognizes we were headed for the Second World War.
Germany is, not just Germany, Europe is seeming incredibly dangerous. In terms of the relationship with the monarchy is not by this stage a vestige of any real political power, but it's still an important figurehead in the minds of the nation. It still has some sort of role on the diplomatic global stage. And the old king, George V, for whatever his merits or weaknesses were, was at least a figure of stability. And I suppose the government of the day were probably not overly enthusiastic, although don't let me put words in your mouth, about having to welcome onto the global stage a new king of the United Kingdom who had been known, I think it would be fair to say, to get more involved as Prince of Wales than might have been welcome with international affairs. Is that a fair summary of how people may have been feeling, or am I mischaracterizing?
No, I think it's perfectly fair. I would pick up one point, which is the practical significance of the monarchy. We are talking about the British Empire, which was still a huge force in people's minds. And the white dominions, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, and so on, were in practice independent countries. The only thing that tied them to the empire was the person of the monarch. So yes, it was a symbolic role, but it was a terrifically important symbolic role in the context of the empire. Uh, Touching Edward himself, there are two aspects to it. Yes, he had certainly, particularly from 1935 onwards, got excessively mixed up in politics. In 1935, as Prince of Wales, he had addressed a huge meeting of the Royal British Legion at the Albert Hall, when he said that the British Legion was the ideal body to, quote, extend the hand of friendship to Germany. And this was just after Britain had signed a naval treaty with Germany, which utterly panicked the French, who thought that they were being stabbed in the back by Britain. So having the future king in effect saying that our goal is friendship with Germany was not ideal. So there was actually a quite unprecedented episode in which Baldwin showed the King, George V, the cabinet minutes about this to support the King kicking his son off for breaking ranks like that. And also, Edward had blundered into the other big political debate of the day, which obviously was linked to the diplomatic situation, which was rearmament, which was, it wasn't hugely controversial, but it was still a very delicate question because the vast bulk of people in Britain were viscerally pacifist after the horrors of the First World War. So Baldwin understood that rearmament was necessary, but knew that it was not to the taste of the vast number of electors. So he had to go very, very gently there. And so when the Prince of Wales blundered into the rearmament debate, admittedly less directly in 1935, that also showed that he was a menace to navigation.
And so, how would Baldwin and other senior government figures have been feeling about Edward's ascension at that time in January 36?
Again, going back to a figure that I don't think we've discussed yet, Sir Horace Wilson, who was right-hand man to Baldwin, a civil servant, and confidant of Baldwin. When Baldwin became Prime Minister, in 1935, one of the things that he set out as his main tasks was to see the Prince of Wales safely onto the throne as king. That is obviously a euphemism for handling a very, very difficult character. So Baldwin, who'd spent 3 weeks together with the Prince of Wales on a tour of Canada, the back end of the 1920s, knew him well and had got a very clear idea of what he was going to have to deal with. One thing which we don't know whether Baldwin was fully alert to was that, as well as blundering into specific political issues, the Prince of Wales also wanted to reverse the constitutional dilution of the monarch's power. He was quite frank to a US journalist that he wanted to re-establish the monarchy as a powerful force. How much Baldwin had picked that up directly, we don't know. But again, if you look at the pattern of what he did, fighting back against those tendencies in the Prince of Wales and later the King, I think are a clear part of what he was up to.
It's interesting that one of the things that we've discovered during this research process for the podcast is Wallace seems to be incredibly either ill-informed or misinformed as to what the powers of the King of the United Kingdom were. And she seems to believe that he's a similarly powerful figure to the American president. And we have wondered if, and obviously she wasn't British, so you can completely understand why she wouldn't be overly well informed about the constitutional settlement. But one wonders whether Edward himself has been misleading to her about what powers he will have or what powers he feels he ought to have, which may be where she gets the impression everything's all going to be a little bit easier than it might in the end have ended up being.
And the Wallace Edward relationship was a toxic mix in a number of ways. And yes, I would certainly agree with you. It is quite possible that he wanted to impress her, that he wanted to appear more powerful in real political terms than in fact he was. And quite possibly she egged him on in that direction. But again, it's guesswork as to whether that was really what was going on. It certainly fits with the event.
Looking a little bit, trying to place this a little bit in the context of the 1930s, with everything going on across Europe, with more extremist movements seizing political power, with there being some sense of fascism in Britain, whether it was distinct from continental fascism or not, I know remains a big debate. But how would a king who is at worst slightly insecure, perhaps a little bit unreliable, perhaps a little bit leaky, or at worst wants to really tinker with the constitutional settlement and press whatever powers he feels he should have as sovereign, how would a king like that unnerve people in government in the context of extremist movements taking power across Europe?
It was, I think, particularly his affection for Germany, not necessarily Nazi Germany, that was possibly most worrying in this context. And I don't think it was particularly complicated. I think the responsible politicians in Britain knew that the stakes were rising, knew that the dangers were growing, and you just did not need a loose cannon in Buckingham Palace to merge two metaphors at the time. I don't think there was any specific concern about Edward on that score.
I suppose a loose cannon, and a loose cannon that had made very explicit pro-German comments in recent years, and indeed seemed to identify as German, which of course, ethnically speaking, he was almost 100% German, so that was true, but seemed to be very aware of that.
Absolutely, he spoke German fluently. He barely spoke French at all. Was notionally or in practice Britain's great ally at the time. There's no element of Francophilia in his makeup. So not very high profile, but the strikes against him were accumulating.
That's helpful, and that helps us very much put him into the context of the years that, well, the year that he was king. So thank you very much, Adrian, for your wisdom on that. And I know we'll be speaking to you later on in the podcast series. Okay, everyone, you're back to the past with Gareth and James. I'm sure that interview was brilliant. I'm sure the questions that Gareth asked were insightful and
everything that you say is insightful.
I'm a big fan of future Gareth. I think he does stuff incredibly well. So hopefully we can now all see testimony to that. So let's go back to 1936, James. We've talked a little bit about early eruptions within the reign. We've talked a little bit about some faux pas that the king made by the standards of the day. We've talked a little bit about why his own conduct of government was worrying people and why that mattered so much in the context of the 1930s. And interestingly, in about February of 1936, Edward gets a visit from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, which the Archbishop has frankly insisted on.
And it is a coded, but not very coded, rebuke to the king about a number of things. But it is clear, and the king was clear from the subtext, that the archbishop is worried about Wallace. What do we make to that intervention?
Well, I think that, there were several different issues, weren't there? One of them was the fact that he wasn't being seen prominently going to church in the same way that his parents had always been during their reign. So I think that was part of it. I think that we need to be quite mindful of the fact that in the 1930s, most families did go to church on a Sunday morning, whether you were Church of England or whether you were Roman Catholic, nonconformist, whatever. It was the done thing that people went and they sent their children to Sunday school. My dad was only born a couple of years later, and he would his grandparents always made sure that they went to Sunday school. You'll be pleased that they were Congregationalists at the time.
I am pleased.
Yes, but it was a great social norm. So I think that the Archbishop of Canterbury rebuking the king, now we would see it. Yes, of course, we know that the king is the supreme governor of the Church of England. We do see him go to church, but I can't honestly see that there would be an outcry if the king were not attending church every week. Whereas in the 1930s, the social norm was very much that people did go to church and that people looked to the leaders of the country to provide that, not only the political leadership, but also a certain moral leadership. And so by not attending church as often as he should have done, in quotes, I think is seen as an indicator of a certain looseness and a certain moral ineptness. And of course, being seen with Wallace also plays into that, because she had been previously divorced. She was an American. But I don't think it was entirely just around her. Although the Archbishop of Canterbury would not have been not have been unaware of the.
The only account we have of the meeting is the Duke of Windsor's account, which was written some years later, when obviously the fallout had been well known. I think the two interesting thing about Cosmo Lang, there's lots of interesting things. So Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was a very venerable figure, devoted to the church, unmarried, and from what I can tell, and I'm certainly no expert on the ecclesiastical politics of the 1930s or of the Church of England at all, but he was a figure of tradition and morality, and very much with evangelical fervour, wanting to resist any sort of changes within the church, had been a great friend of George V, and had always struggled with George's son. And certainly the Duke of Windsor, Edward VIII, as we should probably call him for this podcast, believed, and was probably right to believe, that the king and Cosmo Lang George V and Cosmo Lang often used to discuss Edward and talk about what a naughty young scamp he was, kind of thing. And Edward VIII may even have felt that Cosmo Lang was a aggravator in Edward's relationship with his father, and a nuisance.
Yes, that may well be true. And also, I think it's interesting to note as well that after the abdication and the accession of George VI and Queen Elizabeth, he went on to have a very close and friendly relationship with both of them. And certainly Queen Elizabeth was known to, when her letters were published after her death, had written to the Archbishop about the sessions that they'd had before the coronation, as he was explaining the ceremony, and that when they prayed together, and that what a great comfort that was. And so they did go on to have a very close and friendly relationship. So I think again that I only say that because I think that sort of plays into the difference between the two brothers and their outlooks on life and their positions as well. So I think that is relevant. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that the Archbishop was trying to depose the king in order to bring his brother to the throne. But we said in the last episode, didn't we, that George V had previously said that the boy would ruin himself in 12 months, and I hope nothing comes between Bertie and Elizabeth and the throne. So I think that the Archbishop may have been in the same mindset, that this is somebody who is heading towards a disaster because of his own lack of morals, rather than him trying to precipitate it.
Well, you might not be suggesting that the Archbishop was out to get Edward VIII, but Edward VIII sort of does, because it's very clear from the later Duke of Windsor's own account that he believes Cosmo Lang was a major actor against Edward and Wallace in the abdication crisis. Interestingly, and we'll talk more about that as we bring into next week's episode, I can't see from the source material that he is that active in affairs.
No, and that's the reason that I am not so convinced. It's not that I don't believe that the Archbishop would do that, and I'm not trying to suggest that because he was a churchman and a holy man that he wouldn't be capable of showing that degree of malice. I'm simply saying that because the source material that we have is from the Duke of Windsor, is written much later, there was a great antipathy between them. I'm not certain that we can accept it as gospel in the same way.
I mean, I do think it's absolutely possible that any figure, but particularly someone like a churchman, could be being very active behind the scenes in a way that wouldn't show up in the sources. Because if it's and I'm not saying this happened, and I have no idea really what Stanley Baldwin's personal faith was, but say the Archbishop had been to pray with the Prime Minister and they would have discussed shared confidences at that time, that could be a very intimate, potentially even controlling way of influencing the agenda that's not going to show up in a cabinet meeting minute. Let's talk a little bit about how Wallace starts creeping into affairs, because although I don't think this would have been obvious at the time to people, and it couldn't have been, it seems obvious to me that from the moment Edward VIII becomes king, he starts enacting a plan to make Wallace his queen before he is crowned, which we know the coronation was scheduled for, what was it? Was it April 37? May 37.
May 1937.
And it's quite clear to me, looking at it as a historian, it's quite clear to me that there's a plan in place to introduce Wallace to the British people, free her of her marriage, marry her, and have Edward crowned. And I assume the reason he wants to marry her before he's crowned, and it's clear that's very important, is because it would add to her sense of legitimacy as queen, although that's speculation. And so we see Wallace straight away at the proclamation. And then we start to see, don't we, her name creeping into the court circular quite significantly.
Yes, I mean, she's at a lot of events that he is attending, and she is listed among the king's entourage there. So, but again, I think that looking at those sources, we need to be careful about not. Yes, we know what was going on through hindsight, but the ordinary person who might have read the court circular, and I do accept that a lot of people who didn't, even in the 1930s, even when newspapers were at their height, not everybody would necessarily have been interested in the minutiae of the court. But she was listed merely as a member of the king's entourage. There was no particular significance attached to her name. You would have to read it every day to think, that name keeps appearing a lot.
And her husband's always there, of course. Her husband's there. Which it had to be. You couldn't possibly have her appearing without her husband.
No, that would have been rather too obvious. So I think that, yes, it is significant. It's highly significant that she is constantly at his side, even if her husband's there as some sort of third wheel. But I think that wouldn't necessarily have rung alarm bells with the majority of people at the time.
For those worried about the situation, it would have been a signal, I think. A kind of almost not an in joke, but an in threat, almost.
But again, I think that as with the Archbishop, was it necessarily people thinking, he's wanting her to divorce and so that he can marry her? Or is it more thinking the king is surrounding himself with these people that we think are quite loose, that are not quite the right people to be around the king, and that they're a bad influence? And I think that there was an element of that as well.
Well, where I think that perhaps starts to change in the mind of the government, if it hadn't already, is the 27th of May, which is my birthday, although I wasn't born in 1936, I just look like I was. And Edward hosts, according to sources, his first official dinner at York House and St James's Palace. I don't particularly know what they mean by the first official dinner, but it's because it's not a sort of state occasion.
No, but I think that it was the first time after court mourning for George V.
I see. Right, okay. So court mourning is where you basically, any socialising is kept low-key. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. Right. So any dinners that he would have hosted before then would have been private events.
Right.
Whereas this is, well, it's not public as in its invitation only, but it is something which is, it's not a quiet dinner among friends. It's an official dinner at which there are official invitations sent.
Yes, understandably. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Difficult, of course, for all of us today because we socialise differently today, and probably very few of us are members of that high society class. But it is an important distinction. Now, what's interesting, Wallace comes to this dinner. You've got the Prime Minister and his wife, the Baldwins. You've got other very senior figures like the Mountbattens. And what is fascinating is that at this dinner, Mrs. Simpson is given precedence over the Prime Minister's wife.
Yes.
And I wanted to just pause for a minute there because I think that's huge, but I also think it's not as huge as it might sound. And I think we have to be a bit careful. Precedence is a very tricky concept for us to get our head around as people who live in a society which still operates by precedence hugely, but not in so formal a way or not so knowledge.
Yes.
And often if you go on, like, if you read into Brett's, or if you go on Wikipedia, look at precedents in England or precedents in Scotland, there'll be very formulaic lists that set out who ranks above whom. And it's all about signifying who walks in first at an event, who gets served first at a dinner, who is, in that sense, just more senior. It's not about line of succession or anything like that. But the problem is, precedence in reality is a fluid, an ever-changing situation. And precedence would be different in one setting to in another setting. And all the lists that we find about, which would have something like, it's earls, and then it's, a viscount's eldest son after it, or whatever, whatever it might be. That's a rubbish example. These are not necessarily things that have ever been laid down officially. These lists were pulled together by Victorians who basically observed what seems to always happen and have written these lists as observations. So it isn't a static state. It isn't that if you're given precedence on an occasion, you now outrank that person forever and in all situations. There might be many situations where someone's given precedence, for example, because it's their birthday and they get served first.
Yeah, and a prime example of that was at the late Queen Mother's 80th birthday service at St Paul's, Thanksgiving service at St Paul's Cathedral. It was widely reported at the time that the Queen had given precedence to her mother for the event because she arrived last.
Yes.
And arrived with the Prince of Wales. Well, yes, and as you've said, that was because it was her birthday.
I mean, the way I always try to explain precedence is that, so when we were kids, and we used to go swimming every Saturday, and my dad would take me and my sister, and we're only a year apart. And we would both want to sit in the passenger seat in the front, as we would say it, and we would take it in turns. So one week I would go sit in the front, and one week my sister would sit in the front. So the precedence was sitting in the front in that sense. And it was assigned on the basis of fairness, take it in turns. In other families, it might have been, the precedence might have been assigned on the basis of age. So the eldest always gets to sit in the front, or the behaviour. The person that's been best behaved this week gets to sit in the front. It's all precedence. It's all around us. So going back to this occasion, obviously, at a royal event, even if formal precedences are being used, it's still a notch more formal than having tea at our house would be. And interestingly, the Prime Minister's wife is not really, on official occasions, afforded presidents in any kind of uniformed or organised way. The Prime Minister's wife is not the First Lady in the way that the US President's wife is the First Lady. But nevertheless, you would expect on that occasion the wife of the Prime Minister to be served for a American guest from outside the government system, and it can only be a sign of something that Wallace has given, is treated like the First Lady of that reception. But I think it's the king saying, "This is my partner."
It is, but it's difficult to say this is my partner when she's married to somebody else who is also present.
Yeah, which makes it quite scandalous. But it's kind of the French that I'll say this wrong, but what's the expression? The mistress not the menage, well, it is that, but also the mistress en trente. Is that how you say it?
Yes.
Where you're official mistress, which has obviously never existed in the English system, and would, I think, scandalise the English system. But so I think that's quite a key moment. Moving on to what I think is this I think concerted campaign to get to make Wallace his wife. 9th of July, another dinner at York House. The king introduces Wallace to Winston Churchill, he's not exactly an opposition figure in that he's in the same party, the Conservative Party, as he is now, as the Prime Minister.
He had been.
Yeah, at this stage.
Yes.
At this stage he is. And it's a weird political situation because Baldwin is a Conservative, but he's not leading a Conservative government. He's leading a national coalition government. Yes. And Churchill is sort of the prince over the water, metaphorically, and a big thorn in his side. Churchill and Edward get on. They always have. And I think here is a strategic moment where the king is introducing Wallace to Churchill, and he's basically saying, help make this a reality. There could be something in it for you as well, sort of thing. It's just and Churchill sort of is commenting at this time, and he's still sort of flying sort of unofficial party lines saying, of course, the king would never dream of marrying her, kind of thing. But I think this is all part of the king's campaign. And then, very oddly, and something that gets rarely talked about, and I want to ask you how much you've come across this, but just a little bit after the events I've talked about, on the 16th of July, there is potentially an assassination attempt on the king by a chap called George McMahon, assuming it's like Julian McMahon, the actor. I hadn't really come across this in what I read. I know it was probably mostly when I was a kid I read about the Abdication. How much did you come across this?
I have read it before, yes. I have heard of it. And again, I think that any attempt is shocking. And of course, there was the attempt at the late Queen in 1981 at Trooping the Colour. And while I think this was widely reported at the time, I think that it's simply been overshadowed by the fact that because he abdicated within a year, it's not gained that traction in history that it might have otherwise.
Well, let's just spend a couple of minutes on this, because this is really interesting, and I must confess I'm still trying to get my head around it because it's all incredibly convoluted. But The Crown and Crisis, which is the excellent book that we've recommended already on this podcast before, pulls into this quite a lot. So basically there's this chap called George McMahon. He doesn't fire a shot at the king, but he attends is it Trooping of the Colour? Would that be right? July?
Yeah.
Yes. Attends Trooping of the Colour armed. And then sort of makes it known that he's armed. The gun is, I think he sort of fires a shot at the floor, but not at the parade. Yeah. Someone gets it off of him, and he obviously gets arrested. And then he basically says in court, I've been put up to this, et cetera, by security services. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it to my king, but I've been put up to it. And it's all very weird. And it's what's really weird. And then he's basically dismissed as a madman. So he's given a reasonably lenient sentence. And what is fascinating and has raised a lot of eyebrows is that the trial was overseen by the Attorney General, the chief legal officer of the government, of the Crown, which certainly today would be highly unusual, and from what I can tell, was then highly unusual for an event. So I don't know, and other constitutional experts or legal experts may know, perhaps that's the norm when you're dealing with anything involving the royal family. And what I found fascinating about how this is explored in The Crown and Crisis is, for years, I think this is one of the reasons it's not been much remarked upon. So, okay, this chap was offensive, that's interesting, but let's let it go. However, having looked through Secret Service documentations, Secret Service documentation, I should say, which have been, I suppose, now accessible to researchers to some extent because of time limitations wearing off, etc., etc. It is possible to verify some aspects of what George McMahon says at court. And George McMahon also goes on to write a later, slightly fantastical account of his life in this whole episode. And some of it is verifiable by other evidence. It is clear that MI5, Secret Services, were in touch with him and had been having meetings with him. Now, the most likely read seems to be that what he was saying about some of his earlier career, which is he was basically a bit of a gun runner for the Italians, thought he was in a bit too deep, said to MI5, get me out of this and I'll give you some really crucial information that will help you. And that's what all these meetings with MI5 are about. And that the rest of what he is saying about basically suggesting MI5 are putting him up to assassinating the king is probably fantastical. But the fact that some of his story is verifiable, the fact he does have links with MI5 deserves to be more fascinatingly discussed than it ever has been, in my view.
Yeah, and it's right. Do I believe his account in its entirety? No. Do I think it sounds fantastical that he was put up to try and assassinate the king? Yes. Do I think that means that all of his account is completely made up? Not necessarily. But all I can say is I think, this could be very naive of me, but I think if there had been a plot to assassinate the king, they would have gone to somebody who was a bit more prepared.
I think that's the fundamental point. If MI5 wants the king dead, I don't see. I mean, I suppose if MI5 do want the king dead, they do need to make it look like it was just the actions of a madman who would never be traced back to them credibly. But I still think, I agree with you, I think there are other ways they would have executed without that. All I would say, I think the fact that it doesn't strike, because I don't think you and me are, either of us, particularly tempted by the sort of conspiracy theory line of thought in life in general.
No.
So I think the fact that even people like us who are, we're company men, let's be honest, we both sort of do tend to play by the book in terms of our history. The fact even we are slightly intrigued that the idea that MI5 wanted the king dead sort of fits the political context of the time, I think is quite telling of just how worried people were about Edward.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think people were worried about him. And of course, I think as well, because he'd been so popular as Prince of Wales and was seen to have that sort of common touch, that he was visiting factories and things and mines and things like that. And so that I think that was probably, again, a worry among the government, probably not necessarily with MI5, but certainly with figures that, because he's not particularly conscientious with the state papers, he does fling precedents aside when it suits. He's seen as being a modernizer, which we might think is good, or you might think is absolutely terrible. That is a very Marmite thing. But I think that if he's perceived to have that popularity within the country with lots of ordinary people, then that is a threat, because if he's seen to be too popular, he can get away with far more than he would have done, if there was that. There's always that worry that he could appeal to people, that he could make a direct appeal to the ordinary people, and that he can get away with not being conscientious. It's like Mr. Teflon. Nothing would stick to him because he's seen as being a charismatic and a great leader, even if they know that what they perceive to be the truth.
Well, I think a point that it's important to make at this stage is that Edward's, if you like, social agenda and the visiting of minds, calling attention to the fact that people were in extreme poverty, and it was absolutely right that people were calling attention to that. To us, we look back and think, great, social conscience, royals often do that. They often go to the most vulnerable people and look to become a champion of them. Was he the great modernizer that started all of that, etc.? What will be lost to many of us, but I think is important to recognise, is that same social agenda was very much the platform that the fascist party were campaigning on.
Yes.
And that's lost on us because of the political context. And I'm not saying Edward was a fascist. Frankly,
no, but he certainly had friends who were fascists. I mean, we know that.
From everything I've read, people I've spoken to, the general conclusion seems to be Edward didn't particularly need a politics. He wasn't particularly intellectually curious enough to want a politics, so he didn't really have a politics. But the point I would make is, if you're in 1930s Britain, you're seeing fascist dictatorships crop up in Germany, in Italy,
and Spain.
And Spain. And it could be seen as the new democracy is incredibly young. It is incredibly young in Europe. It could be seen as, a fad that's diminishing. If you've got a king who seems to be on the same page and saying similar things to what the fascists are saying, he is not secure with state documents. The two-party system, Labour and Conservative, isn't working well at this particular point. There's a possibility of fascist MPs being elected. There's a king who may be sympathetic to them, leaking documents to them, potentially. There's no suggestion he was, but his behaviours could suggest he might. You've got him seen to be very influenced by the German ambassador. You've got the king's mistress, Wallis Simpson, rumoured to be having an affair with the German Nazi ambassador von Ribbentrop. I don't think she was, but that it was believed. No. You've got Edward, who is seen to have championed the German cause while he was Prince of Wales, intervening completely outside of what he should have been doing to secure deals with Germany, who publicly talked about how he considers himself German because of his German blood, etc., etc., etc. I can understand why the secret services might think this king needs to go, and we need to find a way of making that happen. I'm not saying I think they did. I don't think it's uncredible in these circumstances that thought went through people's heads.
No, there's an awful lot of things to say about most of that. I think that several things to say are that you have to remember as well that fascism was in the early 30s, although I think by 1936 probably slightly less so, had been seen as a great democratic movement, and those certainly Oswald Mosley and the National Union of Fascists, one of their selling points was that they all wore the black shirt, which was seen as being quite democratic because everybody looked the same, whether you had a lot of money or whether you didn't, and that it was fairly that particular type of uniform was quite cheap to buy, was that anybody could afford it. So it was seen as being a groundswell of popularity from ordinary working class people. Whether that's accurate is debatable, but certainly there was that view at the time that was the case. And it's very interesting about you mentioned about his relationship with Germany, and of course we know that after the abdication, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor visited Nazi Germany. But interestingly, the campaign group, who are of course campaigning for an elected head of state, one of their campaign.
I can't believe you just mentioned on our podcast.
No, but it is relevant to what we're
not biased, everyone. We're open to all views.
No, but it is relevant to what's being said here, because in one of their campaign videos,
I'm going to beep it out. When you say it, I'm going to beep it on the podcast.
They show Edward in a picture with Hitler after his abdication, but interestingly they say that the reason that he had to go was because of his relationship with Nazi Germany, and they don't mention the fact that it was Wallace and that Wallace was divorced and any of those things. I'm not saying that wasn't a factor in people in the know, that wouldn't have been a factor, but I think if it weren't for Wallace, I don't think that there would have been that.
This is what's important, and
well.
this is what's important, because we're getting really into the politics of this. I think it's essential to understand the abdication crisis. I really, really do. However, to go to the other extreme and say it had nothing to do with Wallace whatsoever, it was all about them wanting to get rid of a Nazi. I think it misunderstands how government works, because government doesn't think with one single mind, one single strategy, one single intention. There's many different people involved. But I would say it is pretty clear, and we'll get into this either the next episode or the episode after. I think it is pretty clear that the direct crisis that precipitates Edward VIII going is entirely connected to his decision to marry Wallis Simpson. Yes. And the fact that, and to downplay that is as bad as making it all about a romantic love affair and not thinking about the political dimension.
One thing I will say, that you also mentioned about Wallace and von Ribbentrop, and again, no evidence to support this, but I would guess that it was something that was put around by her enemy, or Edward's enemies, to try and discredit them. Because Nancy Mitford did say in an interview after the war, and of course it must be pointed out that she was the sister of Diana Moseley, but didn't necessarily share her political views. But when she talked about that, people went to the German embassy, and she said, "Well, everybody went because it was the smartest embassy in London. They gave the smartest parties." A lot of people went there that then denied it afterwards.
I'm sure.
So I think that we have to treat that with a degree of circumspection, because would I entirely agree with Nancy Mitford's account? No, I wouldn't. But I do think that she's right in that high society social scene, there were lots of events, lots of parties that were being held. And I think that you can read too much into the political leanings of somebody who would have been invited to something like that.
Yes.
Again, I'm not saying that Wallace didn't have those political leanings. I'm simply saying that a lot of people went to those things as an entirely social.
Yes. I mean, and Wallace does seem to have some sort of direct relationship to the German ambassador, in that he would send her roses and things like that, which don't have to be, I think.
I think that
relationship.
I think that sending flowers and things like that was something that was often done when people would have attended events there. What I think is more significant is that there were rumours, and again, this could be just to try and discredit Wallace, but that she was going round to the German embassy. You said that Edward was seen as being leaky, like a leaky sieve. That it was thought that he had revealed state secrets to Wallace, and she'd gone straight round to the German embassy to go and reveal them.
However, happily, for the people of 1936, the one saving grace to all of this is still that the situation is containable, because Wallace cannot be about to marry the king because Wallis Simpson is married to Ernest Simpson. And what people would not have been aware of at this stage, because it wouldn't come out until the court case later in the year, is that on the 23rd of July, 1936, Wallis writes to her husband, Ernest, in what is a staged letter, Ernest probably helped her write it, informing him that she is filing for divorce because she has found evidence that he was caught in a hotel in Bray, Berkshire, with another woman, and that she can't possibly live with that. So she is going to begin divorce proceedings.
What terribly shocking.
Shocking. Wallis, this bastion of marital monogamy, how her husband Ernest could defile the sanctity of marriage in this way, cannot be accepted. Clearly, this is a stage.
If I were wearing pearls, I would be clutching them now.
Well, quite. This is clearly a stage incident, and it shows Ernest's generosity and complicity in the whole campaign. Because
I'm a little bit more sceptical about that side of it, just because it was at that time it was the done thing for the man to be seen to be adulterous rather than the woman. So I think that that's part of the gender politics of the era, rather than necessarily him going up along with her campaign. But yes,
absolutely. But I think we should just put that into context for people. Basically, if you were divorced, that was very bad for your social status, full stop. However, in those days, there was no such thing as no fault divorce. So you couldn't just decide you wanted to go your separate ways, go to the court and put a divorce through. Someone had to have done something wrong, literally to be at fault, and then the other person could sue them for divorce. So, and one of the grounds was marital unfaithfulness. By this stage, earlier in sort of legal history, a man couldn't actually commit adultery, only a woman could. But by this stage, a man can and his wife can sue him for divorce on that basis. If a man committed adultery and was divorced for it, that was bad, but it was sort of recoverable if you were wealthy or had other assets. If a woman was divorced for committing adultery, she was absolutely toast from a social status point of view, which is why if it was in any way amicable, a man would fall on his sword. Maybe that's not the best analogy. No, be seen with another woman in a public. By public place, we mean a hotel room.
Yes, and you had to be seen as being in flagrante. It had to be in a position where it could be that intimacy could be inferred from it. You didn't actually have to be caught performing a sexual act, but you had to be looking as though you might. So you had to be wearing a dressing gown in the same bedroom or something like that.
It was public enough that I think we have to assume that although it wasn't publicly known this was happening, and it wouldn't be till the court case, people would have become aware that this was happening.
Yes.
And it would have scared the system tremendously. Up until this point, we're halfway through 1936, there's a hope that Wallis is the latest mistress. He might tire of her one day, and for all the other ills of King Edward VIII, perhaps this particular aspect may not be around forever. Now, Wallis is getting divorced. She's getting divorced for a reason, and it changes the whole political debate. And I think that if this would be a good place to pause, and when we come back next week, we could look at how people's knowledge of what Wallis and Edward's plan was completely transforms this conversation.
Indeed. And I think as well, there's also not just the fact that he might tire of her, there's also that the hope that he might tire of her, but there's also that understanding as well that while she is his unofficial consort, his mistress, he can't really do anything with her while she's married to another man. It's kind of an uncomfortable but safe environment, in as much as she can't hold any. Yes, she's got a lot of influence, but it's soft influence. It's behind the scenes. he can't do anything official. And this, of course, does change everything.
It absolutely does. So let's pause here. Thank you for listening, everyone. As we exit, there'll be a slide saying how you get in touch with us with any questions. There's going to be questions at the last episode of this series, but if we said anything you think we've missed, or if you think there's a crucial source we're missing, let us know, because we have time at the beginning of the next episode to review anything we've missed from this one, and we're all enjoying being on this journey together and learning about the abdication crisis. So until next week, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Royal Revolutions is a Royal History Geeks podcast. For more information about our other podcasts, head to royalhistorygeeks.com/podcasts. The Royal History Geeks community is active across Facebook, X, YouTube, Instagram, and Discord. Just search for Royal History Geeks on your social platform of choice, and you should find us there. The first episode of Royal Revolutions dropped in December 2024. The entire first season will focus on the abdication crisis. Toward the end of Season 1, we will devote an entire episode to questions, so please get in touch with us via our socials or at royalhistorygeeks@gmail.com to send any questions about the abdication crisis our way.